They called them colonials. Backwoods boys who couldn't possibly understand the sophisticated art of aerial warfare. When the first Canadian pilots arrived in Britain during the early days of World War II, the reception was colder than a Halifax winter. British commanders looked at these men from across the Atlantic with barely concealed skepticism. Canada? They made decent enough soldiers, perhaps, but fighter pilots? That required breeding, training, sophistication. That required being British. What those commanders didn't know was that they were staring at the men who would save their skies. The year was 1939, and Britain stood alone. France had fallen. The Wehrmacht stood just across the English Channel, their Messerschmitts and Heinkels darkening the horizon. The Battle of Britain was coming, and the Royal Air Force was desperately short of pilots. They needed help. They needed bodies in cockpits. But when Canada offered its aviators, the response was lukewarm at best. Consider the absurdity of the situation. Britain was facing annihilation. Every day German bombers crossed the Channel, targeting factories, airfields, and cities. The RAF was losing pilots faster than they could train them. Yet when young Canadians volunteered to fight, they were relegated to second-class status, given the worst assignments, doubted at every turn. The British establishment simply couldn't imagine that boys from Toronto, Vancouver, and Winnipeg could match pilots from Eton and Cambridge. They were about to learn a lesson in humility that would echo through history. The Canadian pilots who arrived in Britain weren't the privileged sons of aristocrats. They were farmers' kids who'd learned to fly in rickety biplanes over the prairies. They were mechanics who understood engines because they'd spent winters keeping tractors running in 40-below temperatures. They were hunters who'd tracked game through dense forests, developing the spatial awareness and patience that would prove deadly in aerial combat. They were young men who'd grown up in a harsh, unforgiving landscape that had taught them one essential truth: you adapt or you die. And they were about to face the most sophisticated air force in the world. The German Luftwaffe wasn't just well-equipped. It was battle-hardened. Its pilots had cut their teeth in the Spanish Civil War. They'd swept through Poland in weeks. They'd destroyed the French Air Force. They flew the Messerschmitt Bf 109, arguably the finest fighter aircraft in the world at that time. And they were supremely confident. Why wouldn't they be? They'd never lost. But confidence can be a liability when you're facing opponents who have nothing to lose and everything to prove. The 1st Canadian Squadron assigned to combat operations was met with undisguised doubt. British commanders gave them outdated equipment and positioned them in secondary roles. During briefings, Canadian pilots noticed the condescension. The subtle suggestions that they should observe and learn before engaging enemy aircraft. The patronizing advice about tactics they'd need years to master. The unspoken message was clear: stay out of the way and let the real pilots handle this. That attitude lasted exactly as long as it took for the first combat engagement. Picture this moment. September 1940. The sky over southern England is a churning mass of aircraft. German bombers, dozens of them, escorted by swarms of Messerschmitts. RAF squadrons are scrambling, climbing desperately to intercept. And among them, finally given permission to engage, are the Canadians. Young men in their early 20s, some barely old enough to drink, strapping themselves into Hurricanes and Spitfires. Their hands are steady. Their eyes are clear. They've been waiting for this. The British command expects them to be cautious, to hang back, to follow experienced pilots and learn through observation. Instead, the Canadians do something unexpected. They attack. Not with reckless abandon. Not with suicidal bravery. But with a calculated aggression that catches everyone off guard. They dive into formations of German bombers with a ferocity that seems to defy reason. They engage Messerschmitts in turning fights that British doctrine says they should avoid. They press attacks to distances that training manuals call dangerously close. And they start racking up kills. Within weeks, the statistics become impossible to ignore. Canadian pilots are shooting down German aircraft at rates that match or exceed their British counterparts. Squadron commanders who'd been skeptical are suddenly requesting more Canadians. The men they dismissed as colonials are becoming the hunters that German pilots fear. But why? What made these Canadians so effective? The answer lies in the very things that made the British commanders doubt them. These weren't men trained in the rigid structures of elite military academies. They were improvisers. Growing up in Canada meant dealing with isolation, harsh weather, mechanical failures far from help. It meant figuring things out on your own. When something broke, you fixed it. When conditions changed, you adapted. There was no rule book for surviving a prairie winter or navigating the northern wilderness. You learned to think independently, to trust your instincts, to take calculated risks. Those skills translated directly to aerial combat. While British pilots often flew by the book, waiting for textbook opportunities, Canadians trusted their gut. They'd spent childhoods hunting, learning to read movement, anticipate behavior, to shoot instinctively. When a Messerschmitt appeared in their sights for a split second, they didn't hesitate. They fired. And they hit. There was something else too. Something harder to quantify but impossible to miss. These men were angry. Not with rage but with a cold, determined fury. They'd crossed an ocean to fight. They'd endured weeks of condescension and doubt. They'd been told they weren't good enough. And now they had something to prove. Every German aircraft they downed wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a statement. We belong here. We're as good as anyone. Better, even. The Germans noticed. Intelligence reports from captured Luftwaffe pilots began mentioning Canadian squadrons specifically. They described aggressive tactics, exceptional marksmanship, and a willingness to press attacks that bordered on reckless. One German pilot, interviewed after being shot down, was asked about the various RAF squadrons he'd encountered. When asked about the Canadians, his response was simple: avoid them if possible. By the spring of 1941, the transformation was complete. Canadian pilots weren't just accepted. They were sought after. British squadrons competed to have Canadians assigned to them. Flight commanders who'd once questioned their abilities now praised them as some of the finest pilots in the RAF. The dismissive attitudes had evaporated, replaced by genuine respect and in some cases awe. Consider the story of George Bulling. A kid from Montreal who'd been rejected by the RCF because he lacked formal education. He was too rough around the edges, too unconventional. So he made his way to Britain on his own and joined the RAF directly. The British almost didn't take him either. He was difficult, insubordinate, unwilling to follow protocols he considered pointless. But they were desperate for pilots, so they gave him a chance. Bulling became the top Allied ace in the Mediterranean theater. Flying over Malta, one of the most contested pieces of airspace in the entire war, he shot down 31 confirmed enemy aircraft in just 14 days. 31. His shooting was so accurate that other pilots thought he must be exaggerating his reports. Investigation proved he wasn't. If anything, he was underselling his kills. His gunnery was so precise that he could disable enemy aircraft with minimal ammunition, often destroying fighters with bursts of just a few seconds. German pilots called him the Falcon of Malta. The British, who'd initially doubted him, called him a legend. Or take Russell Bannock, a pilot from Edmonton who became one of the war's most successful night fighter aces. Night fighting was perhaps the most difficult type of aerial combat. You're hunting enemy bombers in complete darkness, relying on primitive radar and your own instincts. It required patience, precision, and nerves of absolute steel. Bannock excelled at it. He developed techniques that other pilots copied. His kill rate was so high that German bomber crews began avoiding routes where they knew he was operating. These weren't isolated cases. Canadian pilots were excelling across every theater of the war. In North Africa, they dominated the skies over the desert. In Italy, they provided crucial air support for the invasion. Over occupied France, they escorted bombers deep into enemy territory and engaged waves of German interceptors. And in the strategic bombing campaign against Germany itself, Canadian pilots flew some of the war's most dangerous missions. The numbers tell part of the story. By war's end, more than 250,000 Canadians had served in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. Over 130,000 were aircrew. Thousands became fighter pilots. And they accounted for a disproportionate number of enemy aircraft destroyed, missions completed, and medals earned. 17 Canadians received the Victoria Cross, the highest award for valor in the British military. Hundreds more received Distinguished Flying Crosses, Distinguished Service Orders, and other decorations for extraordinary courage. But numbers don't capture the human reality. They don't show you the young man from Saskatchewan, barely 20 years old, climbing into a Spitfire at dawn, knowing there's a strong chance he won't see sunset. They don't show you the farm kid from Ontario, who'd never seen the ocean before crossing the Atlantic, now locked in a twisting dogfight at 20,000 feet above the English Channel. They don't show you the mechanic's son from British Columbia, exhausted after his fourth mission of the day, being asked to go up one more time because German bombers are inbound and every pilot is needed. These were ordinary young men doing extraordinary things. And they were doing it while being told, explicitly or implicitly, that they weren't quite good enough. That they were second-rate compared to their British counterparts. That they should be grateful for the opportunity to serve under British command. They proved all of that wrong. Not with words. With actions. With courage. With skill that couldn't be denied or dismissed. Consider what it must have felt like for those British commanders who'd initially dismissed the Canadians. Imagine being so certain of your own superiority that you can't recognize talent standing right in front of you. Imagine realizing that the men you'd condescended to, the pilots you'd given second-rate equipment and assignments, were actually among the finest aviators in the world. That must have been a humbling experience. But here's the remarkable thing: the Canadians didn't gloat. They didn't seek recognition or apologies. They just kept flying, kept fighting, kept proving themselves mission after mission, sortie after sortie. Their attitude wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about the job. German aircraft needed to be stopped. Allied bombers needed escort. Ground troops needed air support. So they flew. And they did it better than almost anyone else. This speaks to something deeper about the Canadian character. These weren't men seeking glory. They were doing what needed to be done. The recognition, when it came, was almost secondary. What mattered was the mission. What mattered was protecting their fellow pilots. What mattered was stopping the Luftwaffe. The bond between Canadian pilots became legendary. They looked out for each other with an intensity that went beyond normal military camaraderie. If a Canadian was in trouble, other Canadians would risk everything to help. German pilots learned quickly that attacking a lone Canadian fighter was dangerous. Where there was one, others were usually nearby, watching, ready to pounce. This wasn't taught. It wasn't doctrine. It was instinct. These men had grown up in communities where people helped each other because survival often depended on it. You helped your neighbor in a blizzard because next time, you might need their help. That mentality translated directly to aerial combat. No Canadian pilot was ever truly alone. The tactics they developed became textbook material. Canadian squadrons pioneered aggressive escort techniques that maximized bomber protection while engaging enemy fighters. They refined low-altitude attack patterns that devastated German ground targets. They innovated night fighting procedures that multiplied effectiveness. British and American pilots studied what the Canadians were doing and copied it. Let that sink in. The same military that had initially dismissed these men as backwoods colonials was now using them as the standard. Canadian tactics became RAF tactics. Canadian techniques became best practices. The students had become the teachers. And the Germans? They learned to fear Canadian squadrons. Luftwaffe intelligence kept detailed records of Allied units. Certain squadrons were flagged as particularly dangerous. Canadian units were consistently marked as high threat. German pilots were briefed specifically on Canadian tactics and warned to be especially careful when engaging them. This wasn't respect born of politeness. This was respect earned through hard combat. The Germans knew that fighting Canadians meant a tough battle. By 1943, the tide of the war had turned. The Allies were on the offensive. The strategic bombing campaign was intensifying. Thousands of bombers were flying deep into Germany every day, and they needed escort fighters to protect them. Canadian pilots flew these missions constantly. Day after day, they climbed into their aircraft and flew into some of the most heavily defended airspace in history. German flak batteries filled the sky with explosive shells. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs attacked in waves. And the Canadians fought their way through, protecting the bombers, engaging the interceptors, clearing the path. The losses were horrific. Fighter pilot survival rates were terrifyingly low. In some squadrons, the average lifespan was measured in weeks. Young men watched their friends shot down, saw their wingmen killed, attended funeral after funeral. And then they got back in their aircraft and flew again. Because that's what needed to be done. This is where the real heroism lies. Not in the spectacular kills or dramatic dogfights, but in the quiet courage of climbing into that cockpit knowing the odds. Knowing that you might not come back. Knowing that even if you survive today, there's tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. And still choosing to fly. Still choosing to fight. Canadian pilots embodied this. They weren't Hollywood heroes. They were real men dealing with real fear, real exhaustion, real trauma. But they kept going. They supported each other. They honored their fallen friends by continuing the mission. They proved every single day that they belonged among the finest pilots the world had ever seen. The invasion of Normandy in June 1944 was perhaps their finest hour. Canadian pilots flew thousands of sorties in support of the landings. They attacked German positions, escorted bombers, engaged enemy fighters, and provided crucial reconnaissance. On D-Day itself, Canadian squadrons were in the air before dawn, clearing the skies so Allied forces could land safely. Throughout the day, they flew mission after mission, often landing only long enough to refuel and rearm before going back up. The success of the invasion depended partly on air superiority. The Allies couldn't have landed if the Luftwaffe had been able to contest the skies. Canadian pilots were instrumental in ensuring that didn't happen. They fought with such intensity that German air activity over Normandy was minimal. The troops on the beaches below had Canadian pilots to thank for the clear skies above them. As the Allies advanced across France, Canadian pilots advanced with them. They operated from temporary airfields just behind the front lines, sometimes within range of German artillery. They flew close air support missions, attacking enemy tanks, destroying supply columns, disrupting German communications. This was dangerous work. Flying low and slow made them vulnerable to ground fire. But it was devastatingly effective. German commanders reported that Allied air power, including the relentless attacks by Canadian pilots, was crippling their ability to maneuver and resupply. By the time the war entered its final phase in 1945, Canadian pilots had been fighting continuously for nearly 5 years. Many had flown hundreds of combat missions. They were exhausted physically and mentally. But they didn't stop. As Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, Canadian pilots were there, flying cover, attacking targets, maintaining the pressure. They flew some of their most dangerous missions in those final months, engaging desperate German pilots in jets and advanced fighters. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, Canadian pilots had compiled a record that spoke for itself. They'd flown tens of thousands of combat sorties. They'd shot down thousands of enemy aircraft. They'd supported countless ground operations. They'd escorted Allied bombers through the most dangerous airspace imaginable. And they'd done it all while being initially dismissed as second-rate colonials who couldn't possibly match British standards. The irony is almost painful. The British military, desperate for pilots, had reluctantly accepted Canadian help. They doubted these men, questioned their abilities, given them inferior treatment. And those men had responded by becoming some of the most effective fighter pilots in the entire war. They'd saved countless lives. They'd helped win air superiority over Europe. They'd proven beyond any shadow of doubt that courage, skill, and determination aren't determined by where you're born or what accent you speak with. The story of Canadian aviators in World War II is ultimately a story about underestimation. About prejudice, conscious or unconscious, that blinds people to talent and ability. About the danger of assumptions based on nationality or class. The British commanders who dismissed the Canadians weren't necessarily bad people. They were products of their time and culture, conditioned to believe in hierarchies that placed British elites at the top. They genuinely believed that background and breeding mattered more than actual ability. The Canadians proved them catastrophically wrong. And in doing so, they didn't just help win a war. They challenged assumptions that had existed for centuries. They showed that excellence can come from anywhere. That the kid from the farm might be just as capable as the graduate from Eton. That being born in the right place doesn't automatically make you superior. These lessons went beyond aviation. Canadian troops across all services faced similar doubts and proved similar worth. But there was something special about the aviators. Maybe it was the visibility of aerial combat. Maybe it was the undeniable nature of the statistics. You either shot down enemy aircraft or you didn't. Maybe it was the fact that they were literally fighting above the heads of everyone else, impossible to ignore, their contrails writing stories across the sky. Whatever the reason, the dominance of Canadian pilots became impossible to deny. By mid-war, they weren't just accepted. They were celebrated. British newspapers ran stories about Canadian aces. Propaganda films featured Canadian squadrons. British civilians knew about the Canadians flying overhead, protecting them from German bombers. The transformation from dismissed colonials to elite warriors was complete. But the cost had been terrible. Thousands of Canadian aviators died in the war. Thousands more were wounded, physically and psychologically. They gave years of their lives, their youth, their peace of mind. They saw friends killed. They carried trauma that would never fully heal. The victory was real, but it was bought with blood and sacrifice. The survivors came home to a Canada that was proud but didn't fully understand what they'd been through. How could anyone who hadn't been there understand what it was like? The fear before each mission. The exhaustion after flying multiple sorties. The grief of losing wingmen. The complicated mix of exhilaration and horror that came with combat. These men had been tested in ways most people couldn't imagine. Many struggled to adjust to civilian life. The skills that made them exceptional fighter pilots, aggression, quick decision-making, comfort with danger, didn't always translate well to peacetime. Some became pilots in civilian aviation. Others found it impossible to fly again, the trauma too deep. They scattered across Canada, carrying their experiences privately, rarely talking about what they'd done. This is another tragedy of war. The people who prove themselves most capable, who rise to meet impossible challenges, often pay a price that lasts long after the fighting stops. The Canadian pilots who dominated the skies over Europe came home different. Changed. Some would say damaged. They'd done what their country asked of them. They'd proven themselves against all doubts. And then they were expected to simply resume normal life as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something profound. These men had been part of history. They'd flown missions that would be studied for generations. They'd made tactical decisions that affected the outcome of battles. They'd faced death repeatedly and kept flying. That leaves marks that don't fade. Today, decades later, most of those pilots are gone. The last veterans of World War II are in their 90s or older. Soon, there will be no one left who remembers those days firsthand. The stories will become history, then legend. Future generations will read about the Canadian pilots who were dismissed as colonials and became elite warriors. They'll see the statistics, the kill ratios, the medals. They'll know the basic facts, but they won't feel what it was like. Won't understand the full weight of climbing into a Spitfire at dawn, knowing that death could come at any moment. Won't grasp the brotherhood forged in combat, the bonds created when your life depends on the pilot next to you. Won't comprehend the mix of pride and sorrow that comes with surviving when friends didn't. That's why stories like this matter. Not just as history lessons. Not just as accounts of military achievement. But as reminders of what ordinary people can do when challenged. When doubted. When given the chance to prove themselves. The British commanders who dismissed Canadian aviators made a mistake born of prejudice and assumption. They learned from it, eventually. But by then, young men had already died unnecessarily because they weren't given proper equipment or assignments early enough. That's the cost of underestimation. It's not just hurt feelings or wounded pride. It's lost opportunities, wasted potential, and sometimes lost lives. The Canadian pilots could have been bitter. They had every right to be. They'd been treated as second class despite their abilities. They'd proven themselves over and over, yet some British officers never fully accepted them. They came from a nation that was often overlooked, dismissed as Britain's backwater. They fought under a flag that wasn't fully their own, in a military structure that valued British birth above colonial competence. But they didn't let bitterness consume them. They focused on the mission, on protecting each other, on doing the job that needed doing. That's perhaps the most admirable thing about them. Not their flying skills, impressive as those were. Not their courage, though they had that in abundance. But their refusal to let prejudice define them. Their determination to prove their worth through actions, not arguments. In a way, they were fighting two battles. One against the Luftwaffe, visible and obvious. Another against assumptions and prejudices, subtle and pervasive. They won both. The Germans learned to fear Canadian squadrons. The British learned to respect Canadian pilots. Both lessons were hard-earned. The parallels to other situations are obvious. How many times have talented people been dismissed because of where they're from? How many times have assumptions about background, education, or class prevented recognition of actual ability? How often do people have to prove themselves twice, 3 times, 10 times, just to be given the same opportunities others receive automatically? The Canadian aviators of World War II showed one path forward. You don't fight prejudice with anger alone. You fight it with excellence. With undeniable competence. With results that speak louder than words. You prove, beyond any possible doubt, that you deserve to be there. And then you keep proving it, mission after mission, until the doubts disappear. That's not fair. It shouldn't be necessary. People shouldn't have to be twice as good to be considered equal. But in an imperfect world, sometimes that's the reality. And the Canadian pilots faced that reality head-on. They didn't wait for permission or acceptance. They took to the skies and showed everyone what they could do. Their legacy lives on in multiple ways. The Royal Canadian Air Force, formed during the war, continues to this day. Canadian pilots still train to the highest standards, maintaining the tradition of excellence established by those World War II aviators. The techniques and tactics developed by Canadian squadrons are still taught. The spirit of determination and innovation still influences Canadian military culture. But beyond the military, there's a broader legacy. The story of Canadian pilots in World War II is taught in schools. It's part of Canadian national identity. It's a source of pride, yes, but also a reminder of what Canadians can achieve when challenged. It's proof that this nation, often overlooked on the world stage, has produced individuals of exceptional ability. For young Canadians today, the story carries a message. You don't have to accept others' limitations. You don't have to let assumptions define you. If you have ability, talent, determination, prove it. Let your actions speak. The world might doubt you initially. People might underestimate you based on where you're from or what you look like. But if you're good enough, if you work hard enough, you can force recognition. You can make them see you. That message resonates beyond Canada. Anywhere there are people who've been dismissed or underestimated, the story of Canadian pilots in World War II offers inspiration. It shows that prejudice, while real and powerful, isn't insurmountable. That excellence, when undeniable, forces recognition. That the underdog can not only compete but dominate. The skies over Europe in World War II were contested by the best pilots various nations could produce. German aces with years of experience. British pilots from elite backgrounds with superior training. American aviators with cutting-edge equipment. And Canadian pilots who supposedly didn't belong there. Guess who won? The answer isn't simple. Victory came through the combined efforts of all Allied forces. But the Canadian contribution was far greater than anyone initially expected. Those dismissed colonials, those backwoods boys who supposedly couldn't master sophisticated aerial warfare, ended up setting standards that others tried to match. They did it through skill, through courage, through determination, through an unwillingness to accept the limitations others placed on them. They took every doubt, every dismissive comment, every suggestion that they weren't good enough, and they used it as fuel, motivation, proof that they had something to demonstrate. And demonstrate they did. In dogfights over London during the Battle of Britain. In bomber escort missions deep into Germany. In ground attack sorties across France. In night fighting over occupied Europe. Everywhere Canadian pilots flew, they left a mark. Enemy aircraft destroyed. Allied bombers protected. Ground troops supported. Missions completed against impossible odds. The British commanders who initially dismissed them eventually became their strongest advocates. By war's end, Canadian pilots were sought after for the most difficult missions. Their squadrons were deployed to the hottest combat zones. Their tactics were copied by others. The transformation from doubt to respect was total. But it came at a price that should never be forgotten. Those young men who proved Canada's worth in the skies paid with their lives, their health, their peace of mind. They gave everything they had, and some gave more than everything. They deserve to be remembered not just as warriors or pilots, but as human beings who faced extraordinary circumstances with extraordinary courage. Their story isn't primarily about aviation or military tactics. It's about human potential. About what people can achieve when they refuse to accept others' limitations. About the danger of assumptions and the power of determination. About ordinary individuals doing extraordinary things. When those first Canadian pilots arrived in Britain, skeptical commanders saw colonials, backwoods boys, second-raters who might be useful as cannon fodder but couldn't possibly match British standards. What they actually got were some of the finest combat pilots of the entire war. Men who would help save Britain, help win air superiority over Europe, and help change the course of history. The British establishment learned a hard lesson about underestimation. The Germans learned a painful lesson about Canadian fighter pilots. And Canada learned something too, that its people, when given the opportunity, could stand alongside anyone in the world and not just compete but excel. That lesson echoes through decades. The Canadian pilots of World War II set a standard that subsequent generations have tried to match. They showed that excellence isn't about where you're from. It's about who you are, what you're willing to do, and how hard you're willing to work to prove your worth. They dominated the skies over Europe not because they were given every advantage. Not because they started with respect and proper equipment. But because they were better. Better pilots. Better fighters. Better at adapting, innovating, and overcoming. They took the disadvantages they were handed and turned them into motivation. They faced doubt and responded with undeniable competence. That's the true story. Not just of military achievement, but of human resilience and determination. Of people who refused to be limited by others' prejudices. Who proved, mission after mission, sortie after sortie, that they belonged among the elite. Who earned their place not through privilege or connections, but through skill and courage. The skies over Europe bore witness to their excellence. Every German aircraft shot down. Every Allied bomber safely escorted. Every ground target destroyed. Every mission completed. Each one was proof. Each one was validation. Each one was another nail in the coffin of the assumption that Canadians were somehow less capable. By war's end, that assumption was dead. Killed by the very people it had dismissed. The Canadian aviators who started the war as doubted colonials finished it as recognized elite warriors. They'd earned respect the hard way, through combat, through results, through undeniable achievement. Their legacy is more than historical. It's a lesson for anyone who's ever been underestimated. Anyone told they can't achieve something because of where they're from or who they are. Anyone facing prejudice or doubt. The Canadian pilots showed the path, proved them wrong. Not with words but with actions. Not with arguments but with results. Be so good that denial becomes impossible. They were dismissed. They dominated. And in doing so, they proved that excellence recognizes no borders, respects no artificial hierarchies, and cannot be contained by prejudice or assumption. They showed that capability comes from within, from character and determination, not from birth or background. That's why their story matters. That's why it deserves to be told and retold. Not as a tale of military triumph alone, but as proof of what people can achieve when they refuse to accept limitations others try to place on them. When they channel doubt into determination. When they let their actions speak louder than any words. The British commanders learned. The Germans learned. The world learned. Canadian aviators, those dismissed colonials, were among the finest fighter pilots of World War II. Not despite where they came from, but perhaps because of it. Their backgrounds, their experiences, their attitudes, all of it combined to create warriors who could not be matched. They flew into history with their heads held high and their skills undeniable. They proved that worth isn't determined by others' opinions but by your own actions. And they showed that sometimes, the people most likely to be dismissed are exactly the ones who will exceed every expectation. The skies over Europe remember. The history books record. And the lesson endures. Never underestimate the underdog. Because sometimes the underdog turns out to be the best you've ever seen.